name is Dr. Casey Anne Brimmer. I use they, them pronouns. Welcome to the Affirming Practice Podcast, where we help you walk through some of the more complicated aspects of identity and life, especially in regards to gender, sexuality, intersectionality, and so much more. This is my colleague, Bob.
Hi, my name is Pastor Bob Ierien. I happen to be a pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I use he, him pronouns, and this is work that matters a lot to me and that I am passionate about. And I am just thrilled to be able to partner with Casey Ann on this project.
We want you to know that this space is for you. If you are caring enough to try, to keep trying, to be willing to be wrong, or to be bad at something, to be corrected on occasion in varying degrees of gentleness, and knowing that that willingness to try makes a difference. If you're here for that, then this space is for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I will be the first to say I'm a cishet dude who grew up in South Texas, and I started out on all of these questions really dumb. I didn't know anything. And so everything that I know about gender issues, orientation issues, identity issues, is something that someone has been kind enough to teach me. What I have found is that folks are very willing to teach me what I don't know if I am willing to listen and learn.
I am coming from a place where I've been teaching and learning. I've been learning and teaching about gender and sexuality issues since I was in high school, since roughly 2006, 2007, nearly 20 years, because it's my autistic special interest. I am very passionate about these topics because of that, but also because this is my life. I teach gender and sexuality studies for a living because I believe it's an important issue that everyone needs education on sometimes, including myself. So this is a learning journey for not just Bob, but for me also, and hopefully for you. We want to note that where you are is a valid place to start learning. Everyone has to start somewhere, and we've all had moments of learning about something new and not knowing where to start asking the questions, what questions were maybe dumb questions, or how to take the first step in the right direction for you. Our first couple episodes are about questions and when to ask and who to ask and where to ask and how to ask. And so we're going to jump in with that. I've been speaking with Bob recently about the ideas of context, common sense, and most importantly, perhaps kind curiosity. There's always going to be something we don't know, but that doesn't mean we don't try. And I'm going to give you a quote by Maya Angelou, who said, "Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, you do better." So we've told you a little bit about us, and we want to give you some rules of thumb for asking questions. And so that's going to start with context. The basicness of this is where you are the appropriate time and place for a conversation on these topics. So we can think of a lot of contexts, and one of the contexts for this particular episode is this context. This podcast is a place for you to ask your questions. And I'm sitting here gesturing to Bob like it's him, for those who can't see, but it's for you as in the audience to ask questions, and hopefully we can get to those questions in one form or another. And stick around to the end of the podcast episode and we'll give you a place where you can ask those questions. When I was telling Bob about this for the first time, I think I was telling him about being in my high school history classroom, and I was still a quiet kid who had not yet volunteered to do this kind of education. I was just an out kid. And one of my high school bullies looked at me and asked me how lesbians had sex in the middle of class. And my answer wasn't very appropriate for, for a high school classroom or any classroom.
I
But
have a feeling it was exactly the appropriate answer that he deserved.
no, no. It should have been, but I was going for shock factor, and so it was very, very crass.
Well, so was he. So, fair enough.
Yeah. Um, and so learning about what context to ask these questions in, to ask questions about identity or orientation or lived experiences is important. And I'm wondering, Bob, can you think of like a time where you had to learn the context of when to ask the question?
I've got one that I just ran into a couple of weeks ago. A person who presents as, I would say, gender fluid or non-binary, but I don't know. I want more than anything to be supportive of this person. I see them pretty frequently, but I see them pretty frequently in their place of work, right? Because they work in a business that I frequently shop. That, when they're standing there serving customers is not the context for me to ask them, what are your preferred pronouns? Does this company, treat you correctly as, a member of the LGBTQI plus community, all of that? Like, that's not the time or the place, right? And perhaps at some point, the time and the place will present itself, and perhaps it will not. And in the meantime, I just sort of do my best to be kind and respectful to them the way I would want to be kind and respectful to any other human being. Like, so for me, like, that's a context piece, right? Just because they are a non-binary person or a trans person existing in the world does not make it okay for me to walk up and grill them, right? Even if it's coming from a place of wanting to be supportive and caring. So, like, I'm more likely to ask the person when we're one-on-one, just the two of us, than instead of a room full of people. But I think this is a key thing to understand, that, context does matter. And even, like the example that you gave with your high school bully, like, that was not a question asked from a place of goodwill or good faith, genuinely seeking understanding. But it's important, particularly for those of us who are cishet, to understand that even if our question does come from a place of goodwill and good faith and genuinely seeking understanding, the context is still really important. Like, you don't ask certain things in certain settings. I wouldn't ask one of my parishioners how their hysterectomy went during the announcements on Sunday morning in front of the whole congregation. That's just not the appropriate time and place for that conversation. Those kinds of things.
And I'm going to backtrack for a second. So you've said you're cishet, and our audience may not know what that means yet. I would love to hear your explanation, and I'll add in as necessary.
Okay, so the way that I understand, so cishet is short for cisgender and heterosexual. Cisgender means that I identify as the gender that I was assigned at birth. When I was born, they said, congratulations, it's a boy. And my whole life, I have identified as male. I've been mostly comfortable in that. And so that's how I consider myself. Heterosexual, meaning as a male, I am sexually attracted to females, which is sort of considered normative, which is part of the problem, is that we consider hetero to be normative. That's how I would define heterosexual, that I am sexually and romantically attracted to members of the opposite gender. I'm mashing all kinds of categories. Really well. I'm actually mashing all kinds of categories here and hearing myself mash them as the words come out of my mouth. So I'm sure you're about to give me a better way of describing this. I hope so.
No, you did absolutely amazing. The only thing I would challenge is the idea of an opposite gender. because
Yes, thank you.
opposite implies binary.
Right. And
And
that was one of the things that I felt like you just like mashed that as it came out of your mouth.
yeah, I know that feeling,
I at least got
because
myself from saying the opposite sex. So, and
I'm proud of you.
to jump in
Not
with
hard.
another editorial comment here as the non-expert who's just kind of like learned this the hard way. Um, for a lot of us who have not lived this experience of what it is to be LGBTQIA plus, we have to come into this knowing that we need to unlearn a lot of things. And a lot of things, a lot of language that we just grew up with that was not even intended or designed to be offensive might be, or might not be offensive per se, but might be harmful or not as useful. So, for instance, opposite gender, like that's a thing that's just not helpful because it erases the experience of non-binary people or gender fluid people. Whereas, like, it's not a slur that's designed to be offensive, but it's still something I need to unlearn. And I'm working on those things.
So, for some context as to who I am, because I think that may help with this podcast, is I am a non-binary lesbian who may be on the asexual spectrum somewhere in there. What that means for me, for non-binary, is that there are days where I'll phrase it as, I am not always a woman, I am never a man. And that fits into gender fluidity, but it also really, for me, fits into the non-binary, because when I'm not a man and I'm not feeling like a woman, I'm somewhere in the middle or somewhere beyond the binary that I was told was real my whole life. There are non-politically correct ways for me to say how I identify. Made a whole video called Gender Fucked about my experience with gender in a very like cis normative community in the middle of nowhere, Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and my experience within different contexts influence how I experience my gender. And we'll talk more about that idea of how our understandings of our gender or our identities in general shift in future episodes. But if you're interested now, you can look up the idea of identity saliency, or like how upfront something feels in your experience. Going back to this idea of context, just straight out, there are contexts where it's appropriate to ask questions and contexts where it's not. And we're going to get into ways to figure that out for yourself. And that kind of brings us to this next step of common sense. So you're going to apply everyday social boundaries, and that's not black and white for everybody. As an autistic, I had to learn social boundaries. Like, we all learn them. They're socially constructed. They're made up and they're different depending on who you are and where you are and when you are. But in this case, simply applying everyday social boundaries means things like, if you wouldn't ask someone about their genitals or their medical history in a typical everyday context, you shouldn't ask someone who is trans or non-binary those questions. If you wouldn't ask someone, oh, what did you do in bed the night before? Then maybe you shouldn't ask a lesbian or gay person about how they have sex. And there's not really an appropriate context for those conversations that everyday people are in everyday conversations with people outside of their immediate, like, intimate partnerships.
Right. And I think it's also important to remember that different people will set their own boundaries around these topics in places, and it's important to respect those. So, for instance, I saw a guy posting on Threads the other day, a gay man, and he was, posting about he and his partner's intimate life together, things that I just would not post about mine. He's got a different set of boundaries on that. And that's okay. But I always err on the side of caution, you know, um, unless I am sure that this person would be okay with me asking this question, I'm not going to go there. And also a question that might be appropriate to ask somebody you're really close to when it's just the two of you in the car driving down the New Jersey Turnpike is different than asking the very same person the very same question when you're both standing at the counter at Starbucks and the barista is asking you what you want for your coffee order, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's the common sense piece of, and really, I think a key word in all of this for me anyway is empathy. If I put myself in the other person's place, how would I respond or how would I feel being asked this question by this person in this place at this time? And if the answer isn't, I would be really honored that they're curious, then maybe I need to rethink asking the question in that time and place of that person, etc.
Yeah, definitely can agree there. Going back to, you said you want to ask one of your parishioners how their hysterectomy went from the announcements section of
Right.
your
Or their
service.
vasectomy or their hemorrhoid surgery or whatever.
Yeah, right. So you want to honor people's privacy as well. And I love that you bring in the idea of empathy, because I think that goes into the kind curiosity really well. So basically, kind curiosity is checking your why. Why are you asking this question? Why do you want to know? Are you asking to satisfy your personal nosiness? Um, that's probably not the best reason to ask someone a question about who they are or their life experiences. But asking so you can make sure you use someone's chosen pronouns, that's encouraged a lot of the time. Though you want to take into account context with that too, right? If I'm asking a singular person in a room full of people what their pronouns are, and there are other people privy to that conversation, like right there, that may not be the best idea. That could out this person. Though, if I'm in that situation and I can't pull someone aside to ask, maybe I ask everyone in the room or everyone in that vicinity. Like, hey, I'm Casey Ann. I use them pronouns. Like, what name and pronouns do you go by so I can make sure I treat you with respect? I'll say that some people worry about offending cisgender people by asking this question. Well, should don't you know? Don't I look like a girl or like a man? Don't you know? And yeah, that's a risk. But imagine the kindness you're doing to respect the gender variant, the gender expansive, the non-binary, the trans folks in the space. If you ask the whole space that question, it becomes normal or more normal.
Right. And I think that's a key point is good rule of thumb that I try to live by is I'm not singling any one person out. Even with people who I presume to be cisgender, right? Just learning to put some thought into what I say. If I'm going to ask somebody's pronouns, ask the whole group. Normalizes it. Which, for a long time, I would see other people who I know to be cishet who had their pronouns in like their email signature or in their Zoom window, like you and I both have now. And that felt sort of performative to me until I talked to a couple of trans and non-binary people about that. And they said, actually, I find that helpful because, again, it normalizes the idea that pronouns are a thing to ask about and pronouns are a thing to say, hey, these are my preferred ones, even if I am cishet. That's a normal thing in 2026 is to try to use the right pronouns for people, to use people's preferred pronouns
Yeah.
rather than just assuming.
And you might even get pushback on the word preferred because it makes it sound optional. So
Fair
for
point.
some folks,
Mhm.
they have multiple sets of pronouns and they
Yeah.
have preferred pronouns.
Right.
For me, my pronouns are kind of situational. If I really trust someone, I might give them permission to use certain pronouns. But there are some people in my life, they will never be allowed to call me she, her ever again.
Hmm.
I'm making a point. No. Like my pronouns are they, them, that's it.
Right.
And so there's we're talking about context, and do the same rules of context, common sense, and kind curiosity always apply the same way? No. Depends on so many factors.
Just like any other human communication.
Right. Being mindful of your surroundings, which is something LGBTQ plus people and marginalized and minoritized people have to do almost constantly. So if you are striving to be an ally, then being aware of your surroundings when you're asking questions is more important than it might be in conversations with folks you know are cisgender, heterosexual, who are of identities that are not marginalized or minoritized by societal standards.
Hmm.
So, because you don't want to accidentally out someone, you might ask for pronouns one on one. You might default to using their name when they give it until you can ask for pronouns in a way that's more smaller group, one on one, have a conversation that's more, well, intimate. There's so many different aspects of context and how it applies to common sense. And it all comes back to what you said earlier, empathy, and like I've been saying, kind curiosity.
Kind curiosity is such a great way of describing it because I think for a lot of people, there is curiosity. And some people feel really almost guilty about being curious. And one of the things, in my role as a faith leader with a lot of people in my faith community who really want to be allies and really want to be supportive and welcoming and loving and inclusive and all the right things and for all the right reasons, they almost feel badly about not knowing what they don't know or having that curiosity. And so to be able to lift up for them, look, if your curiosity is growing out of kindness, then you're probably on okay ground. Like you might still make mistakes, but it's the difference between a mistake and willfully hurting someone.
We're going to talk a little bit about how do you receive correction in the next episode. But I want to offer some practical advice of using a search engine, Google, Yahoo, Bing. I don't care which one you use, though they will all be skewed based off of advertisers and all of that jazz. Starting with a search engine to ask your questions is a good place to start. You also have the opportunity to ask people who have volunteered to do this kind of labor. That brings me to something I foreshadowed earlier. This week, I'm going to give you a put it into a practice assignment that's going to be a part of these episodes. This one's two parts. The first part is I want you to apply context, common sense, and kind curiosity into your daily interactions with people whose experiences are different than yours and people who you think their experiences are similar, but you can't know unless you know. And so I'd love for you to leave a comment on the podcast about how that goes for you. And the second is this is us volunteering to answer your questions. And I would love for you to visit the anonymous Google form in the description or on my website to ask questions about gender, sexuality, intersectionality, identity, power, privilege, oppression, things we're going to touch on in future episodes, or maybe even ask about specific situations. So maybe you were one of my high school peers and you witnessed the interaction with my high school bully. maybe you're seeing something like that and you don't know how to respond. How do you step in a way that protects the marginalized person? You could ask about that situation. Or you might ask about, how do I support my queer kid? Or my new trans coworker who they're not out to everybody, but I want to start making shifts so things are more affirming. You can be as anonymous as you choose to be on these. And I'm going to strive to answer all questions I believe to be asked in good faith, to be asked out of kind curiosity. Yeah. Do you have anything to wrap up with, Bob?
I have a question for you. And you were mentioning about, being aware of the surroundings and asking about pronouns and what have you got me to thinking about something that I know some people do, which is they've just started using they them pronouns for everybody. They just sort of talk, in general, they just blanket apply they them pronouns to everybody in the room kind of thing. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
That depends on who's in the room, right? So if I walk in a room, I already use they them pronouns. I'm comfortable with that. But I know some trans feminine and trans masculine people who are more binarized, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if someone uses they them pronouns for them when they use she her or he him, it actually causes feelings of gender dysphoria,
Okay.
which again, future episode we'll talk about gender dysphoria, but essentially it's a really pervasive, ungood, not good feeling associated with being with our gender, right?
Right.
An incongruence between how we are perceived and and who we know ourselves to be, or how we perceive our body, etc. And so, just using they them pronouns would be as could be as bad as saying he him when they only use she her.
And that's why I asked the question, because at first blush, it seems like this is like a safe catch-all, but it's really not necessarily.
Yeah.
And so it's something to be careful of. Like, obviously, again, in some settings, you can't. It's not safe for that person for you to ask them in that setting what their preferred pronouns are, or and I've actually had this experience where someone had shared with me that their preferred pronouns were he, him, but in this setting, I need you to use she, her, right? Because that was what was safe for them. Again, context, common sense, kind curiosity. I think that is such a brilliant framework. And that's one thing I've learned from you that I'm using already and sharing with people. And I think it goes so far towards like what a friend of mine really insists on, which is nonviolent communication, that we are going to communicate with one another as human beings in ways that, first of all, do no harm.
And we're going to talk about harm and risk of harm in the next episode.
Mm-hmm.
I want to add that, like, as a teacher, something that I ask my students is, what pronouns do you want to use in this space? What name do you want to use in this space? Is it different anywhere else?
Mm.
So if we're in this space and you're okay with me using your chosen name and your chosen pronouns, but we go and like somehow I'm in contact with your family or people like we're outside of the classroom, do you still want me to use your chosen name or pronouns? Like, is it a
Right.
blanket, this is what I do? Or is there a contextual aspect to this? Um, I always try to default to names until I know someone's pronoun.
And the reality is we live in a world where, a lot of folks move in and out of different spaces in their lives where they're safe to be themselves in one space and not safe in the next space that they move into. And until we fix that as a culture,
Yeah,
it behooves those of us who want to be helpful and not harmful to be mindful.
for sure. For sure, for sure. All right, friends, that's today's episode. Go forth and take care of yourselves because you're too important not to. And I know that Bob has a tagline he wants to use right now.
Be safe, be well, and remember that you are deeply and profoundly loved.
See you next episode.
See ya.